Sinosure Creek offered no peace for Ethan Kalen Treadwin, 32. Memories echoed. He clutched his Lumina medallion. Sarah Corinna Vestal, 45, appeared nearby. Sinosure Creek offered no peace for Ethan Kalen Treadwin. Memories echoed. He clutched his Lumina medallion. Sarah Corinna Vestal appeared nearby. The weight of the past clung to Ethan like damp clothes, heavy and constricting. Each morning in Sinosure Creek felt like waking in a foreign land. The familiar streets and faces subtly altered, no longer aligning with the world he carried inside him. The coffee shop on Elm Street, where teenagers now huddled over screens instead of dog-eared paperbacks, felt alien. The old hardware store, its aisles once a comforting chaos of metal and wood scents, was now sterile and brightly lit. He walked these streets, a ghost among the living, his gaze often distant, fixed on horizons no one else could see. His posture, once fluid and adaptable, had settled into a perpetual stiffening, a physical manifestation of the guard he held against the world, against the memories that ambushed him without warning. A car backfiring could send a jolt through his system, his hand instinctively reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. A sudden crowd could trigger a wave of unease, a primal urge to find cover, to assess threats that only existed in the theater of his mind. Sleep offered little respite, fractured by nightmares that replayed scenes of chaos, loss, and the impossible decisions made under duress. He would wake in a cold sweat, the silence of his small apartment amplifying the ringing in his ears. The phantom screams, the Lumina medallion smooth and cool against his palm, was a constant anchor, a tangible link to a time when his purpose felt clear, even in the face of unimaginable horror. It was a reminder of sacrifice, yes, but also of the burden that sacrifice had placed upon him. Back then, the mission was everything. Now, simply existing felt like the hardest mission of all. Isolation wasn't just a state of being in Sinosure Creek. It was a shield. He kept interactions brief, polite to the point of being distant. He saw the well-meaning glances, the hesitant questions, the pity that sometimes flickered in people's eyes. He couldn't articulate the chasm that separated him from them, the experiences that had carved lines on his soul invisible to the naked eye. So, he remained an island, adrift in the quiet currents of his hometown, the silence amplifying the noise inside his head. He often drove, aimlessly at first, then with a purpose he couldn't name, escaping the suffocating familiarity of Sinosure Creek. These drives would take him out of the valley, over the winding roads, and into neighboring territories. It was on one such drive, a Tuesday afternoon in the late spring of 2023, that he found himself in Ethel County. The landscape here was different. Rolling hills gave way to flatter plains, dotted with larger farms and stretches of undeveloped land. There was a different kind of quiet here, less like the stagnant peace of Sinosure Creek, and more like the vast, indifferent silence of the open country. He had pulled over near a small, unassuming roadside stand selling local produce. He wasn't sure why. He rarely bought things like this. Maybe it was the vibrant splash of color from the overflowing baskets of tomatoes and peppers, a stark contrast to the muted tones of his internal landscape. He stood there for a moment, the engine ticking cool, the dust settling around the tires. The air smelled of warm earth and something sweet, like ripening fruit. Sarah Corinna Vestal was tending the stand. She had a gentle face, lined not with hardship, but with the soft etching of time and quiet observation. Her eyes, kind and knowing, met his briefly as he approached. There was no flicker of recognition, no hesitant curiosity, just a simple, calm acknowledgement. "Afternoon," she said, her voice low and steady, like the hum of a distant tractor. "Afternoon," Ethan replied, his own voice rougher than he intended, unused to simple pleasantries. He looked at the produce, not really seeing it. His gaze drifted past the baskets to the fields stretching out behind the stand. They seemed peaceful, ordered in a way his life was not. "Nice day for it," she offered, not pushing, just making conversation in the way people do when they aren't expecting anything in return. He nodded, a curt motion. He wanted to leave, to retreat back into the safe confines of his truck and the familiar anonymity of the road. But something held him there. Maybe it was the lack of expectation in her eyes. "Looking for anything in particular?" she asked, her hands busy sorting through a basket of peaches. "No, just ... Looking," he mumbled. She didn't press. She simply continued her work, allowing the silence to settle between them, a comfortable silence, free of the unspoken questions that usually surrounded him. He finally focused on the peaches. They were plump, blushed with red and gold. They looked real, solid, unlike so much else in his life that felt spectral and uncertain. "They're good this year," she said, noticing his gaze. "Sweet, good for eating right off the stem or for a pie." He picked one up. It was warm from the sun, firm yet yielding slightly to his touch. The faint, sweet scent reached him. It felt grounding. "How much?" he asked, his voice a little clearer this time. $2 a pound, she replied. He didn't need a pound. He didn't need any. But he found himself selecting 4, placing them gently in a small paper bag she provided. As he reached for his wallet, the aluminum medallion, which he had been subconsciously holding beneath the fabric of his shirt, shifted. The chain snagged slightly, pulling the worn metal disc into view for just a second before he adjusted his shirt collar. It was a fleeting glimpse, barely noticeable. Most people wouldn't have seen it, or if they had, wouldn't have registered its significance, wouldn't have seen past a simple circular piece of metal. But Sarah Corinna Vestal saw. Her hands paused over the peaches. Her kind eyes, which had held only calm observation moments before, softened further. There was no pity there, no curiosity, no judgment. There was only a profound, quiet understanding. She didn't ask about it. She didn't point to it. She didn't pry. Instead, she looked directly at him, not at his face, but into his eyes, into the haunted depths he usually kept so carefully hidden. And in that look, he saw something he hadn't seen in years. Recognition, not of him as a name or a face from the past, but of the weight he carried. Recognition of the unseen uniform beneath his civilian clothes, of the silent battle still being fought within him. It was more than just seeing a veteran. It was seeing him, the person beneath the scars, both visible and invisible. It was seeing the sacrifice, not as a distant concept, but as a living, breathing burden. "It's a heavy thing to carry," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze still locked with his. She wasn't talking about the medallion anymore. She was talking about everything it represented, everything he was trying to outrun. The words hung in the air between them, simple yet shattering. They bypassed the layers of defense he had built, slipping through the cracks in his carefully constructed isolation. He felt a tremor go through him, a sudden, unexpected vulnerability that was terrifying and, in a strange way, liberating. He couldn't speak. He simply stared at her, the carefully maintained composure he wore like armor beginning to crack. No one had ever said anything like that to him, not with that depth of understanding in their eyes. She offered a small, gentle smile, one that didn't demand anything but simply offered solace. "Some burdens you don't have to carry all by yourself," she added, her voice still quiet, like a gentle current. She finished bagging the peaches, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't rush him, didn't break the fragile connection that had formed in that moment. He fumbled with his money, his hands slightly trembling. He paid her, his gaze still returning to her face, searching for, he didn't know what, confirmation? A sign that he hadn't imagined the depth of her words, the empathy in her eyes. She counted the change, her fingers brushing his as she handed it back. It was a fleeting touch, but it felt significant, a small point of connection in a world that often felt disconnected. "You take care," she said finally, her smile unwavering. "And enjoy the peaches. They're good." He nodded, managing a low thank you. He took the small bag of peaches and turned away, walking back to his truck as if in a daze. He got in, started the engine, but didn't immediately drive away. He sat there for a long moment, hum of the engine a low counterpoint to the sudden rush of emotion inside him. He looked at the peaches on the passenger seat, then at his hand, still feeling the phantom brush of her fingers. He reached up and touched the aluminum medallion, now fully visible, no longer needing to be hidden. Its weight felt different now, still heavy, but perhaps shared, acknowledged. The encounter had lasted only a few minutes, a brief pause in the long, lonely road of his journey, but it felt monumental. It was the first time in years that he hadn't felt completely invisible. Sarah Corinna Vestal, a stranger at a roadside stand in Ethel County, had seen him. She had seen the veteran, yes, but more importantly, she had seen the man beneath, the one struggling under the weight of his past. Her words, "It's a heavy thing to carry," echoed in his mind. They weren't just words. They were a lifeline, offered without judgment, without expectation. They were an acknowledgement of his burden, a silent validation of his struggle. Driving away from the stand, back towards the familiar, yet unsettling streets of Sinisho Creek, something had shifted within him. The weight hadn't vanished, the memories hadn't faded, but a tiny crack had appeared in the wall of isolation he had built around himself. A sliver of light had managed to penetrate the darkness. He still felt the familiar ache in his chest, the tension in his shoulders, but beneath it, a fragile new feeling had taken root. Hope. Not a grand, sweeping hope for instant healing, but a quiet, tentative hope that perhaps, just perhaps, the path towards finding peace wasn't one he had to walk entirely alone. He drove with the windows down, the wind whipping through the cab, carrying the scent of fields and distant rain. He glanced at the peaches on the seat beside him. He hadn't even liked peaches that much before. But now, they felt like something more than just fruit. They felt like a connection, a reminder of a moment when a stranger had offered a simple act of profound empathy, an act that had somehow pierced the armor he wore, reaching the vulnerable core beneath. The road ahead still looked long and challenging, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel utterly insurmountable. He wondered if he would ever see her again, that woman with the kind eyes and the quiet understanding, the one who saw the weight he carried. He drove, the highway spooling out beneath the tires of his worn truck, the late afternoon sun slanting low across the fields of Ethel County. The peaches sat in their small paper bag on the passenger seat, a quiet, warm presence beside him. Their faint, sweet scent was a subtle intrusion on the sterile air conditioning, a reminder of the roadside stand, of the woman with the kind eyes. Sarah. Her words, "It's a heavy thing to carry," echoed in the quiet space of the cab. Simple words, unremarkable on their surface, but delivered with a depth of understanding that had cracked something open inside him. He felt it physically, a tremor that had started in his hands and worked its way through his chest, leaving behind a strange, aching vulnerability. His grip on the steering wheel was tight, knuckles white, a physical manifestation of the control he usually exerted, now strained to its limit. He kept glancing at the peaches, then at his own hand resting on the gear shift, the one that had briefly held the aluminum medallion exposed. It was back beneath his shirt now, tucked away as always, but its presence felt amplified, as if her gaze had somehow imbued it with new significance, or perhaps just revealed its true, raw meaning. It wasn't just metal anymore. It was the physical embodiment of the weight she had seen. The landscape blurred as he drove, the rolling hills of Ethel County giving way to the familiar, enclosed valley of Sinisho Creek. The transition felt jarring. Out there, among the wider fields and distant horizons, there had been a sense of space, a feeling that maybe the weight could dissipate into the vastness. Here, the valley felt tighter, the hills pressing in, the town itself a collection of walls and boundaries that seemed to trap the past within him. He parked the truck outside his small, nondescript apartment building on Sycamore Street. The usual feeling of dread, a dull thud in his gut, accompanied his arrival home. Home. The word felt hollow. It was just a place he slept or tried to. He picked up the bag of peaches, the paper warm and soft. He hesitated for a moment before getting out, sitting in the quiet truck, the engine off. He could hear the distant sound of a lawnmower, the laughter of children playing somewhere down the street, the mundane symphony of civilian life, a melody he was perpetually out of tune with. Carrying the peaches inside felt like a strange domestic act, one that didn't fit the image he had of himself, the man who was always ready for a different kind of reality. He placed them on the counter in his small, sterile kitchen. They looked vibrant, out of place among the sparse, functional items. He touched one, the skin still warm. He didn't eat it. Not yet. The apartment was silent, the kind of silence that amplifies the noise inside one's head. He walked through the rooms, the familiar layout feeling foreign. The worn armchair where he sat for hours, staring at a television he rarely watched. The bed where sleep was a battleground. The walls that felt both too close and too distant, failing to contain the echoing memories. He took off his jacket, his movements stiff and deliberate. He felt the medallion shift against his chest. He pulled it out, holding it in his palm. The worn metal felt cool now, no longer warm from the sun or his skin. He really looked at it, seeing not just the symbol etched into its surface, but the years it represented. The faces of those who weren't here to carry their own weights, the burden of being the one left behind. Sarah's words came back, not as an echo this time, but with a quiet insistence. It's a heavy thing to carry. And then, some burdens. You don't have to carry all by yourself. That second sentence was the one that truly unnerved him. He had been carrying it alone for so long. The isolation, a deliberate choice, a perceived necessity. How could anyone else carry it? How could anyone else even understand it? The chasm was too wide. The experience is too alien to civilian life. Yet Sarah had seen, not the details, not the specifics, but the essence of the burden. She had seen the invisible uniform, the perpetual state of alert, the quiet desperation. He spent the rest of the evening in a haze of introspection. He tried to read, but the words swam on the page. He tried to watch the news, but the conflicts reported felt distant and abstract, nothing like the visceral reality he knew. His mind kept returning to the roadside stand, to Sarah's gentle face, her steady gaze, the way she had simply seen him. The usual evening tension settled in, the hypervigilance sharpening the edges of the quiet apartment. Every creak of the building, every distant siren, every car driving by his window felt like a potential threat, demanding his attention. His body remained coiled, ready. This was the default setting, the state of being that civilian life couldn't override. And yet, beneath the tension, a new feeling stirred, a tiny flicker of something that wasn't fear or despair. It was the echo of recognition, the unsettling possibility that he wasn't entirely alone in carrying this invisible weight. Sleep was, predictably, a battlefield. The nightmares came, fragments of chaos and loss, the familiar surge of adrenaline, the cold sweat. But tonight, woven into the fabric of the dreamscape, there was a fleeting image, a gentle face, kind eyes, a quiet voice saying, "It's a heavy thing." He woke abruptly, heart hammering against his ribs, the phantom screams fading, but the quiet voice lingered. It was different from the usual residue of the nightmares. It felt grounding. He lay in the dark, the familiar ringing in his ears the only sound. He reached for the lumina medallion, holding it tightly. It still felt heavy, but perhaps the acknowledgement had lessened the crushing isolation of that weight. He thought about Sarah, a stranger in a different county, who had offered a moment of unsolicited, profound empathy. Who was she? How could she possibly understand? Her understanding hadn't come from shared experience. He was certain of that. It had come from something deeper, something in her nature, a capacity for seeing beyond the surface. The next day was a Tuesday, much like the day before and the day before that. The routine was his anchor, albeit a heavy one. Coffee brewed in silence, a solitary meal, the aimless hours stretching ahead. He felt the usual pull towards retreating, towards staying within the perceived safety of his apartment walls, away from the casual interactions of Seneschal Creek that felt like navigating a minefield. But the thought of Sarah, of that brief, powerful connection, lingered. It created a subtle friction against the ingrained habit of isolation. He didn't go back to Ethel County that day. The idea felt too bold, too exposed. What would he even say? Thank you for seeing me? It sounded ridiculous. He drove around Seneschal Creek instead, the streets familiar, but still feeling off-kilter. He passed the coffee shop on Elm Street, the teenagers still there, lost in their screens. He saw faces he vaguely recognized, people who offered polite nods, keeping their distance, respecting the invisible barrier he projected. He wondered if they saw anything behind his quiet eyes, or if he was just another fixture of the town's background, a quiet man with a stiff posture. He drove out of town again, not towards Ethel County this time, but in a different direction, towards the low mountains that bordered the valley. He parked at a small, deserted trailhead he sometimes used, a place where he could walk in the quiet of the woods. The rustling leaves and distant bird calls a more predictable soundscape than the sudden noises of town. He walked the trail, his steps measured, his senses on high alert despite the apparent peace. Every snapped twig, every shadow, registered as a potential threat. This was the internal conflict, the conscious desire for peace battling the subconscious programming for danger. He ran a hand over the aluminum medallion beneath his shirt. Its weight felt less like a secret burden today, and more like a fact, something that existed whether he hid it or not. Sarah had seen it, had seen him, and the world hadn't ended. The sky hadn't fallen. It was a small thing, a tiny crack in the armor, but it was there. He found himself thinking about her words again. Some burdens? Some? Who could possibly understand? It felt like a riddle he was too tired to solve. His default answer had always been no one. He had seen things, done things, that separated him from the easy innocence of civilian life. How could someone who hadn't walked through fire understand the burn? Yet Sarah had. Not the why or the how, but the result. She had seen the weight. That felt revolutionary. He sat on a fallen log by the side of the trail, the silence of the woods pressing in. He pulled out the medallion again, turning it over and over in his fingers. It was just metal, etched with a symbol, but it represented everything. Everything lost, everything endured, everything that made it hard to just be. He looked at the symbol, a design he knew intimately, a reminder of the unit, the mission, the sacrifices. It was a mark of identity, but one that felt alien now in this quiet forest, miles from the world where it held meaning. A bird called out nearby, sharp and sudden. He flinched, his body tensing instantly, his gaze sweeping the trees, assessing potential threats. The ingrained reaction was automatic, powerful. This was the reality of the burden. This was the weight. It wasn't just memories. It was a fundamental rewiring of his nervous system, a perpetual state of readiness that was exhausting and isolating. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply, trying to slow his racing heart, to loosen the tension in his shoulders. Sarah's face swam into his mind, her calm eyes. He imagined her saying the words again, not in the quiet of the roadside stand, but here, in the woods, amidst the triggers. The simple acknowledgement felt like a small act of defiance against the chaos inside him. He opened his eyes. The woods were just woods. The bird was just a bird. The tension remained, a low hum beneath the surface, but the sharp edge had softened slightly. For the first time, he considered the possibility that the weight, while his to carry, didn't necessarily have to be carried alone in silence and isolation. Her words had planted a seed of doubt in the fertile ground of his ingrained solitude. The drive back to Sinosure Creek that evening felt different. The valley still felt enclosed, but maybe the walls weren't quite as impenetrable. The thought of the peaches sitting on his counter brought a strange, small sense of anticipation. He still hadn't eaten them. They were more than just fruit now. They were a physical link to that moment of connection, a reminder that someone, somewhere, had seen the unseen burden. He parked the truck, got out, the familiar dull thud in his gut present, but perhaps less intense. He went inside, the silence of the apartment still there, but less suffocating. He walked to the kitchen counter and looked at the peaches. He picked one up, the skin cool now. He held it for a moment, its solidity grounding. He brought it to his nose, inhaling the faint, sweet scent. It smelled of warm earth, sun, and something that felt dangerously close to ... possibility. Instead, he placed it gently back in the bag. He felt a pull, a subtle redirection of his internal compass. It wasn't a dramatic shift, not a sudden cure. It was a quiet turning, like a river beginning to change its course, imperceptible at first, but inevitable. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he had to understand that moment in Ethel County more fully. He had to understand how Sarah had seen him, how her simple words had pierced through years of carefully constructed defenses. He had to understand if that kind of connection was real, if it was something he could reach for, something that could help bear the weight. The road back to Ethel County beckoned, not just as a physical destination, but as a path towards confronting the fragile hope that had been kindled within him. He didn't know what he would do when he got there, what he would say, or if he would even find her again, but the pull was undeniable. He found himself planning the drive in his mind, tracing the winding roads, the fields giving way to the valley. He needed to go back. He needed to see if the recognition was real, if the possibility of not carrying the weight entirely alone was more than just a fleeting moment of grace. The peaches waited on the counter, a silent promise of the journey ahead. The air in the apartment the next morning held the stale quiet of undisturbed spaces, a quiet Ethan knew intimately. He woke before dawn, the residual adrenaline of the night's nightmares still clinging to him like damp sheets. The familiar symphony of internal alarms was already playing, the low hum of vigilance, the sharp spikes of phantom threats, the dull ache of the past. But beneath it, a new note resonated, soft but persistent. Sarah's voice, her eyes, the weight of the peaches on his counter. He went through the motions of his morning routine, each step precise, automatic. Coffee brewed, black and bitter. A piece of toast, uneaten. The silence of the apartment felt different today, less like a sanctuary, more like a cage. He looked at the peaches. They were still there, a splash of improbable color in the sterile kitchen. He picked one up, felt its smooth, cool skin. It felt solid, real, a tangible link to something outside the confines of his own head, outside the valley of Sinosure Creek. He couldn't shake the feeling that had settled over him the night before, the strange pull towards Ethel County. It wasn't just curiosity. It felt closer to a need to understand how that moment had happened, how a stranger could see past the defenses he had spent years building, how her simple words had resonated so deeply, had chipped away at the bedrock of his isolation. The internal debate was fierce, though silent. Every instinct screamed at him to retreat, to stay within the known boundaries of his struggle, however painful. To venture out, to seek connection, felt like exposing a raw nerve. It felt dangerous, but the alternative, continuing as he was, carrying the crushing weight alone, day after day, felt increasingly untenable. The fragile hope sparked by Sarah's empathy was a tiny ember in the darkness, And something deep inside him, something he hadn't acknowledged in years, desperately wanted to see if it could catch flame. By mid-morning, the decision was made, not with a conscious choice, but with a slow, inevitable yielding. He needed to go back. He needed to try and find her. It was illogical, probably foolish, but the pull was stronger than his ingrained caution. He grabbed his truck keys. He didn't take the peaches. They were a reminder, a marker, but the journey itself felt like something he needed to undertake unburdened by physical symbols of the previous encounter. He left the apartment, locking the door behind him, the click echoing in the silent hallway. Stepping outside on the Sycamore Street felt different. The mundane familiarity of Sinosure Creek felt less like a shield and more like a skin he needed to shed, if only for a few hours. The drive out of the valley was the reverse of the day before. This time, he wasn't fleeing Ethel County. He was seeking it. The landscape shifted as he left Sinosure Creek behind, the hills opening up, the sky expanding. The tight knot in his chest loosened fractionally with every mile. There was a sense of possibility out here, a feeling that maybe the air itself was lighter, less saturated with the echoes of his past. He didn't have an address, just a memory. A roadside stand, peaches, a kind face. Ethel County was large. He drove slowly, scanning the roadsides, his gaze sharp, but this time looking for something ordinary, something gentle, instead of threats. The sun was high now, warming the fields, glinting off distant farmhouses. He passed orchards, cornfields, stretches of quiet woods. Anxiety gnawed at him. What if he couldn't find the stand? What if she wasn't there? What if he found her and couldn't articulate why he had come back? The questions circled in his mind, each one a potential reason to turn around, to retreat to the safety of his solitude. But he kept driving. The image of her eyes, seeing him, propelled him forward. He drove for what felt like a long time, past several small farm stands selling various goods. None of them felt right. None held the quiet resonance of the one he was looking for. Doubt began to creep in, cold and sharp. Maybe it had just been a fleeting moment, a trick of the light, a projection of his own desperate need. He was about to consider turning back, the weight of the failed search pressing down when he saw it. Tucked just off the road, beneath a large, leafy tree, was a simple wooden table laden with baskets, peaches, and standing behind the table, arranging a basket of fruit, was Sarah. His heart hammered against his ribs, a different rhythm than the usual fear-driven surge. It was a jolt of recognition, relief, and profound apprehension. He pulled his truck over onto the shoulder, a little clumsily, his hand suddenly unsteady on the wheel. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. Getting out of the truck felt like stepping onto unstable ground. Sarah looked up as his truck door closed. Her eyes, kind and observant as he remembered, met his. There was no surprise on her face, only a gentle acknowledgement. It was as if she had been expecting him, or perhaps simply accepted his presence without question. "Hello again," she said, her voice soft, calm. She didn't ask what he was doing there. She didn't pry. She simply greeted him, a quiet invitation to speak if he chose to. He walked towards the stand, his posture stiff, the perpetual tension in his shoulders evident. He stopped a few feet away, unsure what to say, where to look. The words he had rehearsed in his head, the awkward attempts to explain, vanished. The peaches, he managed finally, the word feeling inadequate. They were good. A faint smile touched her lips. "I'm glad," she said. She gestured to the baskets she was arranging. "Just picked this morning." Silence stretched between them, not awkward, but full of unspoken things. He looked at the peaches, then at her face. He saw the lines etched around her eyes, the quiet strength in her bearing. He wondered again how she had seen him, truly seen him, in that brief interaction. I came back," he said, the words tumbling out, raw and unpolished. because of ... what you said. Her gaze remained steady. Oh. She prompted gently, inviting him to continue but not pushing. He shifted his weight, his hands finding their usual resting place in his pockets, his fingers brushing against the outline of the aluminum medallion beneath his shirt. He hadn't taken it off. It felt like a part of him, exposed or hidden. You said, "It's a heavy thing to carry," he mumbled, looking away towards the distant fields. "And that ... some burdens you don't have to carry alone." He waited, braced for confusion, for platitudes, for the inevitable gulf of understanding. But Sarah simply nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It is heavy," she agreed softly. "The things we carry, visible or not." She didn't ask what he carried. She didn't need to. She had seen the weight itself. This simple acceptance, this lack of demand for explanation, was disarming. "I've carried it alone for a long time," he said, the words difficult, scraping against years of silence. "It feels ... safer that way. Like it only hurts me." "But it hurts you, nonetheless," she observed quietly. He looked back at her, surprised by the directness, the lack of judgment. "Yes," he admitted, the single word thick with unvoiced pain. She reached out, her fingers gently tracing the edge of a peach in the basket. "Sometimes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "when we try to shield the world from our pain, we end up shielding ourselves from the possibility of healing." Healing. The word felt foreign, almost impossible. He had long ago accepted that the scars, visible and invisible, were permanent, that the weight was his to bear forever. I don't single quotes I don't know how anyone else could. He trailed off, unable to articulate the chasm of experience, the specific kind of burden he carried. "They don't have to understand the how," Sarah said, meeting his gaze with unwavering compassion. "They just have to see that the weight is real, that it exists, and that you don't have to pretend it doesn't." She paused, her gaze drifting towards his chest, subtle, acknowledging the medallion beneath his shirt without pointing it out directly. "Some things," she continued, her voice even softer, "are too heavy for one person, no matter how strong they are." He felt a tremor go through him, similar to the one the day before. Her words weren't pity. They were recognition. She wasn't trying to fix him. She was simply acknowledging the reality of his struggle. "Why?" he asked, the question raw and unplanned. "Why do you see it?" Sarah smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "Life teaches you to see," she said simply. "Loss teaches you to see. Carrying your own kind of weight teaches you to recognize it in others." She didn't elaborate, didn't share her own story, but the quiet depth in her eyes suggested a history of her own burdens, different perhaps, but understood on a fundamental level. He stood there, absorbing her words, the quiet presence of the roadside stand, the scent of ripe peaches, the vast open sky of Ethel County. It felt like a different world from the enclosed valley of Sinosure Creek, a world where the air wasn't thick with unspoken history. "It's been a long time," he said, referring not just to his time away, but to the years spent isolated in his pain. "The journey back is often the longest," she said gently. "But you're here." He hadn't thought of it that way. Coming back here, seeking her out, felt less like a step and more like a stumble into the unknown. But perhaps she was right. It was movement. It was a deviation from the ingrained path of solitude. He felt a strange urge, a pull he hadn't anticipated. He reached inside his shirt, his fingers closing around the aluminum medallion. He pulled it out, holding it in his open palm for the first time in front of someone else. The worn metal lay there, simple and profound, a silent testament to everything he carried. Sarah looked at it, her gaze respectful, understanding. She didn't reach for it, didn't ask about the symbol. She simply looked at the weight in his hand, the physical manifestation of his burden. "That's a heavy thing," she repeated, her voice filled with quiet empathy. He nodded, unable to speak. Holding it there, exposed, felt terrifying and, unexpectedly, a little less heavy. Sharing the sight of it, not the story behind it, but the simple fact of its existence and the weight it represented, felt like sharing a fraction of the burden itself. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling inadequate for the depth of the moment. For Dot. Seeing it, Sarah smiled again, a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. "You're not invisible," she said softly, "even when it feels like you are." He stayed for a little while longer, not talking much, just standing there in the quiet space of her understanding. He didn't buy any more peaches. He didn't need a physical reminder this time. The connection itself was the anchor. When he finally turned to leave, the movement felt less stiff than when he arrived. He didn't know what would happen next, or if he would come back. But something fundamental had shifted. The impermeable walls around him felt less solid. The possibility that the weight, while his, didn't have to be carried entirely alone, no longer felt like a fleeting dream. It felt real. He drove away from the roadside stand, from Ethel County, the landscape blurring again. But this time, the feeling wasn't one of escape or retreat. It was one of fragile hope, of a path tentatively taken. He was still Ethan Kalen Treadwin, 32 years old, carrying the unseen weight. But now, he carried it with the knowledge that someone had seen it, acknowledged it, and offered a quiet validation that cut through the years of isolation. The journey back to Sinosho Creek felt less like returning to a cage, and more like returning to a place from which he might, just might, begin to build something new. The peaches waited on his counter, silent witnesses to a turning point. The path forward was uncertain, steep, and fraught with the lingering echoes of the past. But for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel entirely solitary.